The city buzzed with life like a heated cauldron. Cars honked, pulling out of traffic. Pedestrians maneuvered between street vendors and billboards. The air was thick with noise, odors, and human bustle. The sun was already slipping toward the horizon, casting a copper glow on the sidewalks when she appeared, a pregnant woman in a wheelchair. Her face was calm, but there was a tiredness in her eyes. In that brief moment of silence she found amidst the chaos, the woman tried to focus on the path ahead. Her hands moved the wheels of the wheelchair smoothly, barely perceptibly shaking from the effort. For a moment it seemed as if the whole world had forgotten about her, leaving her alone. But the world rarely leaves alone those who can't defend themselves. Through the dense veil of people, a shadow loomed on the horizon, ominous and menacing. A biker. His massive motorcycle roared like a wild animal as he made his way through the crowd. He wore a leather jacket covered in mud, and his helmet bore symbols that made passers-by avert their eyes. His gaze searched for a target, and he found one, a pregnant woman in a wheelchair. The biker swerved, braking so close to the sidewalk that the bike kicked up mud on the feet of passers-by. His heavy boots thudded against the concrete as he dismounted, like a predator smelling prey. The people on the street fell silent. Some slowed down to look around, others simply sped up, trying not to draw attention to themselves. But the biker's eyes were fixed on the woman. She noticed him. Her hands froze on the wheels of the wheelchair and her face went pale. He took a step forward, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. It was that silence before the storm, when even the wind dies down so as not to disturb the predator. "Hey, you!" The biker's voice was hoarse, scalding, as if every syllable was drenched in hate. The people around him froze, but no one approached. The woman turned her head, and desperation read in her eyes. She tried to pull back, but the sidewalk was too narrow, and the aisles that might have been an escape were blocked by the dense crowd. The biker smiled predatorily and took another step. His shadow covered the woman like a harbinger of impending tragedy. The biker stopped right in front of her, blocking the road with his massive body. The motorcycle was left behind, but its engine continued to roar, like a beast demanding blood. The woman in the wheelchair clutched the rims of the wheels nervously, her breathing ragged, but she tried to remain calm. The biker leaned over, his dirty helmet glinting in the setting sun. He squinted his eyes, scrutinizing the woman with such disdain as if she were something less than human. Then he grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "What do we have here?" He stretched out, his voice oozing mockery. "You think the street is for people like you? Who let you out of your houses anyway?" The passers-by looked away again. The noise of the city seemed to subside, giving way to the ugly scene. People ran past, not wanting to get involved, though their faces expressed embarrassment and fear. The woman raised her eyes, trying to meet his gaze, but the force of hatred emanating from the biker made her turn her face away. She tried to respond, but her voice betrayed her. "Why don't you say anything, huh?" he continued, taking a step closer. "Or do you think your wheelchair is your shield? You're no better than the trash on the sidewalk." His words cut to the heart. The woman could barely hold back her tears, her hands trembling, but she tried again to move backward. But the wheels of the wheelchair caught on the uneven sidewalk and she couldn't move an inch. The biker laughed loudly. The laugh was rumbling like a roll of thunder that seemed to echo down the street. "Jesus, look at this," he shouted, turning to the crowd, but no one answered. He turned back, his face hardening. "You think your pregnancy makes you special? People like you would be better off if you didn't exist at all. Breeding more wimps is all you're good for." Those words pierced the woman like a knife. She clenched her hands tighter on the wheels of the wheelchair, but she could no longer look away. This time, there was no fear in her gaze, only defiance hiding the desperation. "Do you even realize how disgusting you look?" he added, leaning in so close that the woman could smell the alcohol on his breath. "And someone else has to pay for people like you. My taxes feed these parasites." His voice grew louder and his movements more aggressive. He kicked one of the small wheels of the wheelchair, causing it to nearly tip over. The crowd around him froze, but no one even tried to intervene. The tension was building. People watched as if paralyzed as he continued his abuse. "And now what? Are you going to cry?" he mocked, looking at her eyes, tears welling up in them. "You can't even do that properly." At that moment, something in the woman broke. She lifted her chin and looked directly into the eyes of her tormentor. But instead of feeling stronger, he only grinned, satisfied with his power over her. And a few meters behind them, unseen by both of them, stood a man who wasn't going to let this go. His eyes glittered with anger, and his hands clenched into fists. Jason Statham took the first step. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, whether you have had something similar happen in your life, and how you dealt with it. Your opinions and stories are very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation and new exciting stories. And now to continue. The silence of the street became icy. The biker's motorcycle continued to roar on the curb, its vibration emphasizing the oppressive atmosphere. Passers-by, who a moment ago had been darting back and forth, now only occasionally cast brief glances at what was happening. No one stopped. No one dared to interfere. The biker took another step, finally blocking the path of the woman in the wheelchair. His boots thudded on the sidewalk like a judge's gavel passing sentence. "You think I'm just going to walk away?" His voice was venomous, filled with hatred. "Do you people like you think you should be pitied? That everyone owes you something? You can't even do anything for yourselves, let alone be helpful to others." He pointed roughly at her stomach. "You decided to have a baby too?" He laughed, loudly, harshly, as if mockery were his second breath. "That's really pathetic. Another future invalid, huh? The world is only getting worse with people like you." The woman tried to keep her composure, but her hand shook as she reached for the wheels of her wheelchair to turn around. He noticed this movement and stepped forward sharply, kicking her wheelchair so that it rocked backwards, nearly flipping over. "Where do you think you're going?" He threw threateningly, squeezing her shoulder with his rough hand. "I'm not done with you yet." His gaze was filled with rage. The woman looked up at him, trying to say something, but her throat constricted with fear. She felt pain shoot through her shoulder from his grip, but she didn't make a sound. "You should know your place," he hissed, leaning closer. "Your place is in the shadows, away from normal people. We work so you people like you can sit on our neck veins and squeeze everything you can out of the system." The crowd around them stirred, but no one approached. People only furtively pulled out their phones, taking pictures from a distance. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and fear. "That's normal, right?" The biker suddenly addressed the crowd in a loud voice. "Is it normal that my tax dollars go to people like her? Is it normal that parasites like that walk our streets?" Someone in the crowd looked away. Someone else kept filming, but no one responded. The biker turned to the woman again. His hand lunged forward and grabbed one of the wheelchair's small wheels. He jerked sharply, causing it to roll off the smooth surface of the sidewalk onto the rough, scrubby tiles. The wheelchair creaked, and the woman lost her balance. She threw up her arms to defend herself, but that only made him laugh more. "Look at you," he shouted. "You can't even stand, and you're climbing into this world as if you mattered." The woman felt tears boiling on her face, but she tried not to let them spill over. She tried to hold her head high, though inside she was trembling with fear and humiliation. "Come on, show me what you can do." He leaned over her, pushing the wheelchair again. "Or are you just a piece of meat, unable to defend yourself?" The crowd around them continued to watch silently. People who could have intervened turned away, pretending not to be concerned. And only one man in the crowd could no longer remain indifferent. Unnoticed, silent, he watched it all from a distance, clenching his fists. Jason Statham took a step forward, his gaze focused and his breathing deep. It was the moment when the world around him froze before the storm that was about to break. On a street corner, slightly hidden from view by the chaotic crowd, stood a man. His gaze was hard, focused, like a hunter stalking prey. Jason Statham. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary passerby. A leather jacket, simple jeans, the shadow of a baseball cap hiding his face. But the tension in his posture betrayed the inner struggle that raged within. From the moment he'd noticed the scene, Jason had felt anger building in his chest. He saw the biker, a man with a look of hatred on his face, approach the woman in the wheelchair. Saw her eyes express desperation and fear. He heard the biker's hate-filled words cut through the air. "We have to put up with this shit," the biker shouted into the crowd, pointing at the woman. "You, all of you, turn a blind eye to the fact that people like her are destroying our world. These pathetic, worthless creatures. They don't deserve to share the sidewalk with us, let alone live next to us." Jason frowned, his fists clenched, the skin on his knuckles turning white. He saw the biker kick one of the wheels of the wheelchair roughly, causing the woman to stagger, nearly falling over. The movement made him take a step forward, but he stopped. His heart was beating at breakneck speed, like a warrior's before a battle. "If I intervene now, this will escalate into chaos," he thought. "But can I let it continue?" The crowd around them only made the situation worse. Some continued to take pictures on their phones, while others simply turned away, pretending not to see anything. No one moved to help the woman. Statham saw those faces, a mixture of fear, indifference, and a secret relief that this was not happening to them. "I'm telling you, people like her need to be taken out," the biker continued, his voice louder. "Let them go where they don't bother anybody. They don't belong here. You hear me?" He turned to the woman again, leaning over her. "You don't belong here." The words were like a jolt to his nerves. Jason clenched his teeth. His shoulders tensed, and he inhaled deeply. This was a moment of choice. Intervene, and things could get out of hand. Stay out of it, and this act of humiliation would continue, possibly leading to even worse consequences. He looked up. His gaze fell on the woman in the wheelchair. Her arms were still shaking, but she was trying to hold on. There was no anger or pleading in her eyes, just pure, piercing pain and humility. It shattered the last doubts in him. Jason took a step, then another. His gait was confident but quiet. No one in the crowd had noticed him yet. The biker was too absorbed in his show, the crowd in its fear. But every step he took brought the denouement closer. "Are you going to cry?" The biker continued, his voice growing more and more arrogant. "Come on, show everyone how weak you are. That's all you can do." That was enough. Jason stopped a few meters from the stage, his eyes locked on the biker, his gaze cold, as if X-rayed. He inhaled deeply, letting the anger transform into calm determination. At that moment, the woman in the wheelchair raised her head. Her eyes happened to meet his, and although she didn't know who he was, in that brief moment she felt a glimmer of hope. In his gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen around her, a promise that this humiliation would not go unpunished. Jason nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to let her know she wasn't alone, and he wasn't going to let it go on. The biker show was coming to an end. It was Jason Statham's turn. "You think that's it?" The biker's voice became almost bestial, his every syllable saturated with hatred. He glanced at the crowd as if expecting applause for his cruelty, but met only silence and downcast eyes. This only seemed to anger him more. "Okay, since you're all such cowards, I'll show you how to deal with garbage." He shoved the woman's wheelchair. She rocked forward, almost losing her balance, but she managed to hold on. Her breathing became ragged and her eyes widened in horror. She instinctively raised her arms, trying to defend herself, but that only made the biker more angry. "Look at you," he shouted, grabbing one of the wheels of the wheelchair again. "Helpless, weak, pathetic. That's all you can do. Give birth to more people like you and hope someone will solve your problems." He made another push, this time harder. The woman in the wheelchair lost her balance and collapsed onto her side, hitting the pavement. A cry of pain escaped her lips, and the sound pierced the air like an alarm siren. Her stomach was under the impact, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around it, as if trying to protect her unborn child. The crowd around them held their breath. Some turned away, unable to look. Others remained frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. Phones kept filming, but no one moved to help. A woman lay on the ground, her wheelchair overturned nearby. She tried to lift herself up again, but pain stiffened her movements. Her eyes filled with tears. "That's it?" The biker smirked, looking down at her. "Maybe now you'll realize where you belong. On the ground, at the feet of those who are really worth something." His words sounded like a sentence. The woman tried to get a word out, but her voice was drowned in pain and fear. She clutched her stomach again, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What? Does it hurt?" He continued, his voice shaking with gloating. "Maybe it's a sign that you shouldn't breed. We don't need any more parasites like you." The crowd continued to watch. Some stood with clenched fists, but their feet remained chained to the spot. Others glanced around nervously, clearly hoping that someone else would make the first move. There was fear on their faces, but there was something else in their eyes, sympathy and shame. And at that moment, as the silence was becoming almost deafening, he emerged from the crowd, Jason Statham. His gait was slow but sure. He stepped forward, leaving the shadows behind him. The crowd parted before him like waves before a rock. His gaze was focused on one thing only, the biker, who still stood over the woman like a victor over defeated prey. The biker noticed the movement, turned his head, and met a cold, icy stare. Jason stopped a few feet away, raised an eyebrow, and spoke quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think you're big and strong when you attack the defenseless?" At that moment, something in the air changed. The stage was no longer a show for an indifferent crowd. It had become a battlefield, and the outcome was obvious. The crowd was numb as they watched Jason Statham cross the distance between himself and the biker. His footsteps rumbled on the sidewalk like the approach of thunder before a storm. His eyes burned with cold anger, but his face remained as impenetrable as a stone mask. It was as if the whole world stood still, focused on the scene. The biker turned to him, his face contorted into a contemptuous grin. He glared at Jason, clearly not recognizing who he was dealing with. "Who are you, hero?" the biker threw, his voice brash and defiant. "Decided to stick up for this one?" He nodded toward the woman who was still lying on the ground next to the overturned wheelchair, clutching her stomach. "You think I'm going to be scared of you?" The biker took a step forward, exposing his chest as if trying to emphasize his superiority. "You're one of them, aren't you? One of them that protects the trash on the streets? You think the world is a better place with people like her?" He pointed a finger in the direction of the woman. "Or are you just another weakling who thinks he can stop me?" Jason said nothing. His silence was frightening. He continued to stare straight into the biker's eyes, not looking away for a moment. That silence was louder than any words, and even the crowd felt the tension cover the street like a heavy blanket. "What? You're speechless?" The biker scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. He took another step, getting within arm's length of Jason. "Come on, try something. Show me how you defense guys can fight." That was it. Jason moved forward, his movement as lightning fast as a predator's strike. He grabbed the biker by the jacket and dragged him forward. The crowd gasped as the biker, who had seemed so formidable and strong, lost his balance and collapsed to the pavement like a sack of garbage. The impact was deafening, and the biker coughed, gasping for air. Jason let him go, but remained standing over him as if he were the embodiment of justice. His voice was cold as steel. "You think you can talk about people like that? You think your pathetic, filthy superiority gives you the right to humiliate and attack the defenseless?" The biker, having recovered from the first shock, tried to rise. His face was red with rage, but his eyes were now filled with fear. "You bloody," he began, but he didn't have time to finish. Jason struck again, swift and precise, knocking out the weapon, a folding knife the biker had managed to pull from his pocket. The knife fell to the pavement with a clatter, and the crowd froze, unable to believe their eyes. "I'm not going to say it again," Jason said, his voice menacingly calm. "You either get up and walk away, or I'm going to make you regret ever going near that woman." The biker, who seconds ago had been feared by the crowd, now seemed pathetic. He rose to his feet, retreating a step, but his pride wouldn't let him just walk away. He tried to speak again, but Jason motioned at him, his footsteps silencing the biker. The crowd stirred, people whispered, someone shouted, "Serves him right." But before anything else could happen, the biker cast one last look at Jason and the women, flipped his bike over, and, dropping it dirtily on the pavement, walked away, blending into the crowd. The decoupling will be in the palm of your hand, but the voltage is at the limit. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. Share your thoughts. It's important to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation and exciting new stories. And now we continue. The crowd stood in mute tension. The biker, Jason, had just laid on the pavement in one swift movement, rose to his feet. His face blazed with rage, his eyes filled with hatred and anger. The threats and humiliation he'd shouted minutes earlier were now reflected in his gestures. He wasn't going to limit himself to words anymore. "You think you're tough?" he wheezed, wiping at the corner of his mouth that was already bleeding. You think you can humiliate me like this in front of everyone? I'll show you who's in charge. I'll show you why people like me rule this world." He dashed to his bike, his movement swift but filled with chaotic anger. Under the seat, he pulled out a chain, a long, rusty chain with heavy links that jingled like harbingers of trouble. The biker brushed dirt off the chain, wrapped one end around his arm, and slowly turned to Jason. There was a sinister menace in his grin. "Come here, hero," he shouted, waving his chain in the air. "You think protecting trash makes you a better person? You're just like them. You're a weakling who thinks the world can be fair. But I'll show you how reality breaks people like you." Jason stood still, his gaze remaining cold and focused. He was watching the biker's every move, not responding to his provocations. The woman, still lying on the pavement next to the overturned wheelchair, struggled to her elbows. Her eyes widened as she saw the biker swing his chain. "Stop, please," she whispered, but her voice was drowned in the noise of the crowd. The people around them whispered. Someone started shouting, "Stop!" But no one moved. No one dared to interfere. They all knew that something was about to begin that was better watched from the sidelines. The biker stepped forward, swinging his chain. His first blow was swift, but Jason dodged it, easily deflecting it to the side. The second blow was more aggressive, the chain whistling through the air, aiming for his head. Jason blocked it with his hand, twisting the chain and yanked sharply, making the biker lose his balance. But he wasn't going to give up. He jumped forward, using his weight to push Jason down, and the fight began. The biker threw several punches, his fists rough but strong. One of them hit Jason, causing him to take a step back. That gave the biker time to swing the chain again, but Jason reacted instantly, ducking and grabbing his wrist. The biker yelped in pain, but that only made him angrier. "You're going to regret this," he yelled, trying to get free. "I'll break you. You don't understand who I am. Men like me always win, and people like you and her," he nodded at the woman who was watching in horror, "are just dust under our feet." The words, spoken with such hatred, made Jason completely angry. He spun the biker around, using the force of his own inertia, and threw him to the ground. The biker landed with a thud, but immediately jumped up, grabbing a metal pipe lying nearby. His face was now contorted with animal fury. The first blow from the pipe came right next to Jason, making the sidewalk ring loudly. The second blow was to the side, but Jason managed to deflect it by grabbing the pipe. A furious struggle ensued, the metallic sounds of the pipe and chain mingling with the shouts of the crowd. The crowd came alive again, some shouting words of encouragement to Jason, others just filming, keeping their eyes on the battle. The biker tried to strike again with the chain, but Jason dodged, his movements quick and precise. Finally, he was able to snatch the pipe from the biker's hands and toss it aside. The next blow was short and sharp. Jason struck him in the area of the solar plexus. The biker collapsed to his knees, his face contorted in pain, but he was still trying to get up. "That's enough," Jason said, his voice flat but threatening. "You've proven who you are. Now get out while you can." But the biker, breathing hard, rose to his feet again. His face was drenched in sweat and blood, but there was a mad fire in his eyes. The battle continued, and now every blow, every movement was drenched in brutality. Blood was already dripping on the pavement, and the crowd seemed unable to take their eyes off the scene. It was a struggle not only physical, but also ideological. The force of hatred against the force of justice. The crowd, which had recently been silent, now began to shout, splitting into two sides, and each blow reminded them that there was more at stake than just this fight. The sidewalk, flooded with the orange light of the setting sun, became an arena where two forces clashed: hate and justice. Shouts and blows echoed down the street, attracting more and more attention. People began to gather around, and the crowd was no longer silent. "Run him over!" somebody shouted from the depths of the crowd, and the voice, low and harsh, seemed to open the floodgates. Others echoed him. "Knock 'em down! These miserable wretches must know their place." Jason heard the words, but didn't turn his head. His attention remained focused on the biker, who, despite his wounds and pain, was still trying to get up. The biker clung to his bike, using it as a support, and forced himself up. "You think you're better than me? You protect trash, wimps, and those who shouldn't even live in our world. You're just like them. Weak." The crowd roared. Those who stood closer began to support the biker, shouting slogans that made the scene even more somber. "Give the streets back to the real people," shouted the man with the red baseball cap, his face twisted with anger. "This is no place for people like her." He pointed to a woman in a wheelchair who was still trying to get up, grasping the overturned wheelchair. Her face was a mixture of pain and fear, but she wouldn't give up. "Yes, she belongs at home," echoed an elderly woman in the crowd. "They are only taking advantage of us, taking our money and our future." On the other side, where the young people were standing, cries of protest began to be heard. "What are you saying? She's a human being like the rest of us," shouted a girl in a brightly colored jacket. "Is it normal to attack a pregnant woman in a wheelchair?" "Shut up," shouted the man on the other side. "You're just a child. You don't understand anything." A verbal altercation began. People who had initially stood silent now began to choose sides. The racism that initially came only from the biker seemed to infect part of the crowd, fanning the flames of hatred. "You think that wheelchair makes her special?" shouted someone in the crowd supporting the biker. "We all work to keep people like her in the system. Let her know her place." "Do you know your place?" shouted a man from the other side. "If you let yourself do that, you're worse than anyone." The shouting grew louder and the tension more and more unbearable. The crowd was already like a split mass, with each side trying to outshout the other. But none of them came any closer. No one dared intervene in the fight between Jason and the biker. Biker, hearing the encouragement, felt a surge of new energy. He straightened, gritting his teeth against the pain, and swung the chain again. This time he aimed not at Jason, but at the wheelchair that still lay beside the woman. The clang of metal against metal echoed down the street as the chain struck the wheel, warping it. "That's it," shouted the biker, looking at the woman with malicious satisfaction. "Let her realize she doesn't belong here." The woman cried out, trying to reach for her wheelchair, but she was too weak. Her trembling hands slid across the metal, leaving a trail of blood. "Enough!" someone in the crowd shouted, but the words were drowned out in a new explosion of insults. Jason couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward sharply, grabbing the biker's arm before he could land another blow. Their gazes met. The biker's eyes were hateful. Jason's were cold, unrelenting rage. "You think that makes you strong?" Jason hissed, pawing at his arm. "Attacking a woman? Attacking the defenseless? You're nothing." He yanked the chain, ripping it from the biker's hands, and tossed it aside. The crowd froze. The people who were supporting the biker were silent for a moment, seeing how easily Jason was handling him. But their silence didn't last long. "This is not the end," shouted one of them. We are outnumbered, and we will not let the likes of her be here." "Then go," Jason replied, not letting go of the biker. "I'm waiting." The words were a challenge that no one dared to accept. The crowd murmured, and some began to disperse, but the tension still hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jason let go of the biker, who fell to his knees, gulping for air. But it wasn't a victory. It was only a respite before what was to come next. The air in the street seemed dense, as if heated with tension. Every eye in the crowd was fixed on the finale unfolding before them. Jason stood over the biker, his strong figure casting a long shadow that seemed larger than himself. The biker, wounded and exhausted, was still trying to get up, but his movements were slow and his gaze clouded with pain. Even now, however, his face was distorted with anger. "You won't get anywhere," the biker wheezed, trying to grab onto his bike to stand up. "People like her don't deserve your protection. They're parasites. They take everything, and all they give in return are pathetic excuses for their worthless lives." These words echoed over the street, and part of the crowd began to cheer him on again. "Yes, he's right," shouted someone from behind. "How much longer are we going to put up with these people? Why do we have to feed them and their freaks?" Others, however, began shouting back, defending the woman. "Shut up. She's a human being and she deserves help like the rest of us." The crowd began to split again, the noise increasing. But Jason wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the biker, his hands clenched into fists, steel glinting in his eyes. "You still think that makes you strong?" Jason said calmly, but with obvious contempt. "You're attacking a woman in a wheelchair. You humiliate her because she wasn't born like you. That's not strength. That's cowardice." The biker raised his head, his face contorted in a mad grin. "Cowardice?" he wheezed, his voice full of venom. "No, it's an order. People like her should not live among us. They're a nuisance. I did what you weaklings don't have the guts to do. It was enough." Jason stepped forward and grabbed the biker by the collar of his jacket, lifting him to his feet in one motion. The people around him froze, some of them gasping, waiting for the next blow. But Jason didn't. His words were so quiet that they seemed to be addressed only to the biker, but everyone heard them. "If you ever touch someone who can't defend themselves again, I'll make you wish you'd never been born." The biker tried to answer, but Jason's hands were pulled apart, and he collapsed to the pavement again. The crowd murmured, some even shouted, but Jason turned away from his defeated foe. He stepped toward the woman in the wheelchair, who was still lying on the ground, struggling to rise. Her hands were shaking, her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with fear and pain. "It's okay," Jason said softly, kneeling down beside her. His voice was full of sympathy now, and his movements were careful. "You're safe now. Let me help you." The woman nodded, unable to speak. Jason lifted her wheelchair, straightened it, and gently helped her sit back up. She cried out quietly as her body touched the seat. The pain was too great, but she tried not to show weakness. "The baby," she whispered, clutching her stomach. "Is he going to be all right?" Jason looked at her, his face focused. "We'll call an ambulance right away," he said, pulling out his cell phone. "You'll be in the hands of the doctors in a few minutes. It's going to be okay." The crowd began to slowly disperse. Some, seeing that the fight was over, began to disperse, but many still stood watching. Their faces expressed a mixture of emotions: shame, admiration, anger. Some were taking pictures on their phones, some were arguing with others. The biker, lying on the pavement, groaned, trying to get up, but no one in the crowd extended a hand to him. His support dried up as soon as he was defeated. Now, even those who had earlier shouted racist slogans turned away, as if they did not want to be associated with him. When the ambulance arrived, Jason helped the paramedics carry the woman into the car. Her face still showed fear, but there was gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered as the ambulance door began to close. "Thank you for everything." Jason didn't answer anything. He nodded as he watched the ambulance drive away, leaving the street silent again. The crowd began to disperse, some still discussing what had happened, but no one approached Jason. He stood alone, watching the sun finally set, hiding the day behind the horizon, a day that none of the witnesses would forget. The sirens of the patrol cars broke the dense silence of the street, which seemed frozen after the tragedy had played out. Red and blue flashing lights reflected on the windows of shop windows, illuminating the pale faces of those who still stood paralyzed on the sidewalk. The cops jumped out of their cars, moving quickly toward the center of the crowd. The biker, who had caused fear and hatred for so long, was now lying on the pavement, unable to get up. His face was contorted with pain, and his pride was finally crushed. "He attacked a woman," someone in the crowd shouted, finally deciding to break the silence. "It was horrible. He was pushing her, saying terrible things. And he tried to hit her with the chain," another voice added. "We saw the whole thing." However, not everyone in the crowd shared this sentiment. The group of people supporting the biker continued to stand apart. Their faces expressed dissatisfaction, and some even whispered to each other, "He didn't do anything special. He just said what everybody thinks. That Jason guy. Who was he to interfere?" One of them grumbled. "He was just being a hero." But their voices were drowned in the condemning murmur of the majority. The policeman, after listening to the eyewitnesses, approached the biker, who struggled to raise his head. "Get up," one of the officers said briefly, and his tone was adamant. "You're under arrest for assault." "You don't understand anything," shouted the biker, trying to justify himself. "People like her don't deserve to be here. It's not a crime. It's the truth." The policeman did not react. His hands rattled in the handcuffs, and the screams he continued to shout now sounded muffled, as if from far away. The crowd watched in silence, and it was only when the patrol car drove away that the tension finally began to subside. Jason stood aside, his figure standing out from the people who were still discussing what had happened. He watched the ambulance drive away, taking the woman in the wheelchair. She needed medical attention, but her look of gratitude remained in his memory. It was the only time she had ever felt safe. Someone in the crowd approached Jason. "It was incredible what you did," the man said, stammering slightly. "Yeah, I didn't know what to do. You saved her." "Thank you," the woman with the child added. "If it hadn't been for you, this could have ended even worse." Jason only nodded. His face remained as impenetrable as ever. He knew he'd done what he had to do. He didn't need applause or thanks. All he wanted was for the world to be a little better for a moment. Without a word, he turned and began to walk away, his footsteps sounding confident but calm. The crowd parted in front of him, giving him a stare. Some people were filming him on their phones. Some were quietly discussing what had happened, but no one dared to stop him. The story quickly went viral across the city. News portals, social networks, and newspapers were filled with headlines: "Attack on pregnant woman in wheelchair," "Unknown hero stops racist act of violence," "Justice in action." People argued in the comments, some defending the biker, talking about his right to free speech. but most condemned his actions, calling them a disgrace. The woman in the hospital recovered slowly, but her condition stabilized. Her baby was safe thanks to the timely help. She asked for the name of the man who had saved her, but no one at the hospital knew it. Only Jason's picture flashed on the news, taken by someone in the crowd, and his figure became a symbol of courage. This case left an imprint in the hearts of many. Some realized that indifference makes them complicit in violence. Some saw that even in the darkest moments there is room for light. But for Jason, it was just another day to do what he had to do. Not for glory, not for gratitude, but because it was the right thing to do. As he disappeared around the corner, the city began to come alive again, but the memory of that day remained as a reminder. Good always wins if there are those who are willing to fight for it. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? It is important for us to hear your opinions, because your every word is very valuable to us. We appreciate each of you and your support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like so you don't miss new stories. We wish you a good and peaceful day.